Chapter 30. Saturday morning. The next morning, she woke after a surprising amount of sleep, had a quick shower, and thought about what she would do next. Mac contacted her at 8 a.m. and said, "Garage sales are generally early, so when do you want to go?" "The sooner, the better. I'd like to be back relatively quickly." "Okay," he said in surprise. "Do you still want to go?" She nodded. "Yes, I still want to go. Besides, there aren't very many, are there?" "I've picked 5 from the list I found this morning," he said. "Chances are 2 or 3 of them will have absolutely nothing, but the others might have something of interest." "Perfect," she said. "You sound distracted. Are you okay?" he asked sharply. She frowned. "Yes. We'll talk about it when you get here. Oh, and by the way, did you look up that woman's name?" "I did," he said, his voice suddenly quiet. "We'll talk about it when I get there." And he hung up. She could hardly be pissed off at him when that was exactly what she had said to him, but at the same time, it was irritating. Downstairs, she grabbed a piece of toast, made herself a cup of coffee, wondering if Mac would need one too. At the thought of leaving, she worried that she didn't have a lock on the exterior side door into the garage, nor was there a working lock on the rear kitchen door. It looked to be damaged. She tried to lock it, but it didn't take too much jiggling to make it pop open again. Not liking that at all but having little choice, she propped a kitchen chair under it, and then went into the garage and did the same thing. She didn't know if it would keep anyone out, but it gave her some peace of mind. Mac arrived within a few minutes, but he remained on the porch. She offered him a coffee. He shook his head and said, "Why don't you just bring yours in a travel mug? I'll drive." And that was what she did, hopping up into his truck. They headed out to the first garage sale. As they parked outside the house, she was amazed to see a good half-dozen people wandering through tables set up outside. She'd never been to a garage sale before, so she was curious to see how this worked. Mac headed for the tools, and she wandered up and down the tables, but didn't see anything of interest. She found everything from Tupperware to odd plates to baby clothes to toys. She smiled when she got to the pet toys, but they'd been thoroughly chewed, and who knew what kinds of diseases they might have. She walked back over to Mac, who was waiting for her. He looked at her with a raised eyebrow. She just shrugged and he nodded. He said, "Okay, on to number 2. They hopped back into the truck and Doreen said, "Are they all like that?" "Like what?" "Like people's stuff that they don't want and they're just trying to get rid of?" He chuckled. "Absolutely, they're all like that, but sometimes there are estate sales where somebody's passed away, and it's left to somebody in the family to empty out the house." "Oh," she said. "That might be a little rougher." "Or better," she added. "Exactly," he said. "Come on. You'll have a better idea by the time we get through all 5. The second one was very much the same as the first. The third one was different in that it had a lot of high-end dishes and plates and cutlery and pots and pans and stuff. She was itching to buy a bunch, but she really had no idea what she could use, or when. Mac, on the other hand, was looking at a huge cast-iron frying pan with a lid. She studied it and said, "I'm not even sure I could lift that sucker." He chuckled. "But it's really good for cooking on a fire. And it's good in the oven too." He finally bought it for $5. He appeared to be very pleased. He was still crowing about the price when he got into the truck, saying, "That's a steal." He looked over at her. "You didn't see anything you wanted?" "I did," she said, "but I don't want to fill the house I'm still trying to empty." "Actually, that's very insightful," he said, "because one of the best things you can probably do once you get the furniture sorted out is go through all of Nan's cupboards and get rid of stuff. Not just pick and choose, but do every corner. That'll help you to make it yours. It'll also let you see any damage on the property that needs to be fixed, and help you to move in fully. I'm not trying to move Nan out, but just have you acknowledge there'll be a lot of her stuff that you don't want. Privately, she thought that was a wonderful idea. At the fourth place, Doreen stopped in front of several beautiful blankets. She looked at the price. Mac was at her shoulder and he asked, "Do you like them?" "I'm not sure what the winter will be like here, but I like to sit outside in the evening, and I want something to wrap around my shoulders." He helped her shake out a couple of them, and the woman who owned the residence said, "I'm looking for $20 for each of those." Mac nodded and said, "We don't have that much." "How about 30 for two?" Doreen gasped, wondering if that would fly. The woman frowned and then said with a shrug, "Sure, why not?" He paid her the 30 and carried the blankets, while Doreen kept wandering around. She was absolutely over the moon. The blankets were cuddly and soft. One was large, one was smaller, and they were gentle colors of a baby blue and a baby green. As far as she was concerned, this made garage sales completely worthwhile. She wandered up and down the rest of it, but didn't see anything else she wanted. When they got back into the truck, she grabbed the blankets and pulled them onto her lap. "These are beautiful," she said, "and I do have the money to pay for them." "I know you do," he said, "because I haven't paid you for the gardening yet." At that, she burst out laughing. He grinned. "One more and then we'll head home." "Good," she said, "because even though we got a lot done yesterday, so we're well ahead out of the game, there's still more to do." "I wanted to take a look in that basement again," Max said. "I'm pretty sure a couple more pieces matched up. The more we can get to match, the better chance you'll have of selling the pieces." She nodded. The last garage sale didn't offer anything she was interested in. As they pulled up into her driveway, she hopped out happily with her beautiful blankets in her arms and said, "Coffee?" "Absolutely," Max said. They went inside, and he stopped in front of the chairs gathered in the living room. "Two of these chairs belong with the dining room tables we've put out in the garage. I'll just move them." She heard him and smiled. "Thank you." He came back a moment later, a frown on his face as he looked to the kitchen door to the garage. "Explain." She winced. "I had an intruder last night." "What?" His eyebrows shot up to his hairline. "And you didn't let me know immediately?" he roared. "Well, I chased him down to the creek and up about 10 houses, she confessed. "But when he went over the fence and disappeared into one of the backyards, I didn't think I could catch him." He just clawed his hands into his hair, looking like he wanted to pull his hair out in frustration. She explained, "I think I know who it was and maybe I know why, but I don't have all the answers. So I'll do a little more digging before I tell you my theory." His glare deepened. She tried to glare back. Only his was better. "Besides, do you have some information for me on that nurse's ID?" He reached into his back pocket, pulled out several pieces of paper, and unfolded them. "She went missing a good 30-odd years ago," he said. "Her body was never found, and there were absolutely no suspects." Doreen snatched the pieces of paper from his hand and studied them. She worked at a clinic on Bernard. She nodded slowly. "Wow, interesting." She sat at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and brought up the address of the clinic. It wasn't there any longer, and was now a pretty rough area of town. "Because we never found a body," he said, "we don't know for sure that she's even dead, but we assume so." "So no family or friends had any contact afterward? She just disappeared off the face of the earth?" "Essentially, yes. She finished her shift at 5 o'clock that day. She walked home, but nobody saw anything, and she didn't arrive home." "Wow," she said. "I wonder what went wrong." She stared off in the distance, her mind trying to fit the pieces together, but they weren't fitting. She looked at Mac and asked, "What about Penny's father?" "It's on the other sheet. Also a strange one. Shot dead in the head on a street. A back alley, actually. Again, nobody knows anything." And we don't know about the nurse, if she was shot either? No, since no body was found. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down beside her. Are you thinking it's the same person? She nodded. I am. I just don't know the motive behind it. Well, I know the motive behind one. I'm not sure about the motive behind the other. Okay, that's getting interesting, he said. You seem to have a handle on cold cases nobody else does, so how the devil do you link these two? Because Randy Foster was at that halfway house down on Bernard, she said. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he and the nurse worked together, or if she wasn't involved in some way. You're saying she might have killed Penny's father? He asked in confusion. That doesn't mean it's the same person then, because if she committed suicide, we would have found her body. No, that's not what I mean. She shook her head and looked toward the garage. Some stuff I still have to go through in my head, but I haven't had a chance yet. I've been a little busy. He thrummed his fingers on the kitchen table and said, You're not making sense. You know that, right? I am, she said, and it will make sense, but... She tilted her head at him and said, Look. Can you give me an hour? Just an hour to sit down, map out some of the stuff in my head, and I'll present my ideas to you. But I don't want you hovering over my shoulder while I do it. He just stared at her. I know. I know. You're the official. I'm nobody. We don't do this on assumptions. We need evidence. He bolted to his feet, gave a curt nod, and said, 1 hour. And he went back to the living room to start moving furniture. She grabbed the little black book she hadn't had a chance to look at thoroughly, and started reading it with a notepad beside her, jotting down notes. She was formulating a pretty strong case, but she didn't understand why the book had been left behind, although it had been jammed in the back of the drawer, so maybe it had been lost for decades. And she had the larger journal George had kept as well. That one showed an unraveling state of mind. She flipped to the last page where he'd written that cryptic message, wrote it down again, and sat back, looking at the pieces. On her laptop, she brought up the picture of where the nurse had worked, and wondered what could possibly be the connection. If Penny's father had died immediately from a gunshot wound, then nobody would have needed the nurse's help. And then, Doreen knew what it was all about. She sat back and said, It hasn't been an hour, but do you want to come in? He was at her side, glaring at her, his anger vivid. While he'd been busy moving furniture from the basement to the living room, he'd obviously been getting angrier and angrier. I don't have all the answers, she said. All I have is a working theory. Which means it's an assumption, not evidence, she underlined heavily with her tone. His frown deepened. She rolled her eyes at him. Open mind, please. He nodded, sat with a thud, and said, Go for it. Penny's father was very abusive. He beat up the family after his wife died, took out his temper on the kids. His son ended up dead. Father did jail time. We know all that, right? Mac nodded. Penny moved on, married George, probably told George, or maybe he already knew about her terrible history, and was likely very protective. Then her father gets out of jail and moves to a halfway house in Kelowna, because that's close to where Penny lives. Mac settled back, crossed his arms, and said in a low voice, Go on. I couldn't figure out why the nurse was involved, Doreen said, but if you think about it, Penny's father was dangerous. He's only been in jail 10 years, plus whatever he earned for bad behavior. When he's released, it's not like he's infirm now. It's not like he's elderly. Chances are he's one badass angry male. And he comes to Kelowna to see Penny, who wants nothing to do with him. But what if they could knock him out? They could then kill him. Whoa, 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 Max said. Who is they, and how will they knock him out? With the nurse's help, she said. No reason for the nurse to help. I don't know how that fits in yet, Doreen admitted. But the theory is, they needed the nurse's help for some reason. Father was in a halfway house, and somehow they got him alone out in the alleyway, and they shot him. That's a really big jump right there. Let me continue, she said. Whether this is Penny and George, just George, somebody else in their circle of friends, I don't know. Father is gone. Brother is gone. Penny is married. Soon afterward, poor Johnny disappears, and maybe George starts a journal to deal with his feelings. I know that's not a very manly thing to do in some circles, but over the years, maybe there is an unraveling sense of guilt that George has done something terrible, and it's because of him that Johnny went missing. Mac looked at her, looked at the journal she held, and snatched it from her hand. He flipped through a few pages and said, "Wow." She nodded. You can see as you read from the beginning to the end how there's definitely a sense of guilt. George never writes down what he did that was wrong, but it's clear how he felt. He was afraid his actions may have been behind Johnny's disappearance. As if through some karmic rebalancing. Or as if fate had stepped in and said, you know you killed so-and-so, so we killed so-and-so in revenge. Mac frowned. So you think George had something to do with Penny's father's death? Then Johnny gets killed and George blames himself, and what happens at the end? She said, honestly, I think George commits suicide because it just got to the point where he was unraveling. And whether Penny was having an affair or not, as some have speculated, I can't say because I don't know about that. There had to have been some sort of trigger, and it could have just been the passage of time, the accumulation of all that guilt of George's. It could have been mental illness run amok, but George ended up killing himself. So then Penny had nothing to do with any of this, and your suspicions were completely wrong, he asked for clarity. Because, although suicide is frowned upon in many sectors of society, it's not against the law in Canada. It was decriminalized in '72. And of course Penny wouldn't be charged. No, I no longer think Penny had anything to do with George's death. Mac settled back with a sigh. If George did have something to do with her father's death, we can't prosecute a dead man anyway, so that would mean any murder case would never be closed. Well, we're back to that theory versus evidence problem again, she said. I need evidence to make my theory stand. I still don't understand how the nurse comes into play. I don't either, she admitted. But she has to. Somehow she has to. In what way, though? Because that ID card, she said, was buried right there on George's property. On Penny's property. That is the one piece of evidence we can't argue with. It connects George and therefore Penny to the nurse.